Welcome back, everyone. We are just delighted to have Sarah Davidson here with us. Thanks for those of you who appeared during the breakout room and just allow me to put you in a breakout room and just joined right in. That is the spirit of middle years. We're going to go to the second section of our three-part session today, and Sarah's going to talk about working with Indigenous stories. Thanks, Sarah. Back to you.
I feel like I'm on the radio. This is fantastic. Okay, so, oh goodness, I'm advancing on my little laptop and not on the big screen. Okay, so I just want to talk, I'll just kind of talk through some ideas for you to think about traditional Indigenous stories. And I really love what Moses says, that the purposes of storytelling are to entertain, educate, and to help us heal. And so we want to think about them as being used as a pedagogical tool to transmit knowledge. They connect us to places, to identities, and to histories. And they're often separated into two kinds of stories. And this is me talking. I've, in different nations, definitely more West Coast focused. I hear about these two different kinds of stories that are some that speak to a nation's history and some that are more focused on life experiences. But please don't, it's not generalized completely. It's something that I've noticed when I learn about stories from different nations. So Dr. Joanne Archibald, who is amazing, talks about becoming story ready. And I really, really love this work. And so I'm going to go through at a relatively brisk pace, which is the opposite of what she recommends, which is to be able to kind of slow down and sit with stories. So she talks about becoming story ready, and she talks about the 4 R's that are involved in becoming story ready. They are 4 of the Indigenous story work principles that she writes about in her book, Indigenous Story Work. But she specifically speaks about these: respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. And so that's sort of before we even start listening to the story, we want to get into the space. And if we're working with students, we want to think about supporting them to get into this space of being able to connect with, develop a relationship with the story, and make meaning from the story. And so respect involves deep listening. Responsibility has to do with the way that we treat the story with respect, but also making sure that we're sharing it accurately. Reverence is about how I sort of think about it as holding the story gently. And so making sure that we're treating it with the respect that it deserves. And reciprocity. And I really love this idea that she talks about, that we are giving back by sharing with others to ensure that the knowledge continues. And again, this is with making sure that we're adhering to the protocols. So it's not just sharing because we've heard it. And I'll speak to that in a moment. My slides are doing this funny thing where half of the slide changes. So hopefully, there we go. It just then finishes. So when we're talking about public traditional stories, we want to, engage with storytelling. We want to choose a public story to retell. This means that the nation has given permission for the story to be shared, usually for educational purposes. You can storytell with other stories, though, that aren't traditional stories. If you're feeling a little bit nervous about maybe not knowing the protocols or not being familiar with a particular nation's protocols, you can engage in storytelling with kind of mainstream stories that have been published, just to practice and to follow the protocols you would with a story, but then use them with these stories that don't necessarily have protocols. We want to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the story. So we want to recognize that it has been translated from an Indigenous language, which means that it's already changed. The meanings have already changed. So we want to really be sure that we adhere to the story as it's being shared and make sure that all of the key elements are there. We want to make sure that when we share the story, we tell about the nation that it comes from and why we're allowed to share it. And so, for example, Dr. Archibald has shared different stories that she said these can be shared in educational contexts. So with the retelling, you would then say, I'm sharing this story because Dr. Archibald in her video or in her book said this one can be shared publicly, but we're acknowledging who has given us permission. If there's a different storyteller, we're acknowledging that. So in, I've actually got it right here. I don't have it right here. I thought I did. In a book, it's called Journeys for Justice. It's from the 90s. It's a fantastic resource. You can find it online. She and her colleague, I'm just going to look up their name, Gordon, so Archibald and Gordon, 1994, they do, there's a chapter in the grade 3 book about working with stories, and it's probably some of the best, most practical advice. It is available online. I did forget to put it on the resource list, so if somebody remembers to message me, I will share it with you. And in that text, there is some really, really good information about sharing stories and working with stories. So in that, and just because it says grade 3, it can be used with any age. I use it with adult students all the time. But there are stories in there that the nations have given permission for them to be used in this context. So the stories are told with no explanation. If we think about those Aesop's fables at the very end, it says, and this, this tells you that you should never do this or always do that. And the idea with these kinds of stories is that we offer the story, but we don't offer an interpretation. In fact, we often invite the children or the students to share what the meaning that they've made with the story, and they learn from one another, and we might share our understanding at the end. A talking circle, just being sure that you're doing kind of sharing knowledge as opposed to doing a specific talking circle, because there are often protocols connected to a talking circle, but using that to discuss different aspects or individual understandings of the story can be really, really helpful. And I've always been amazed at, from those discussions, the different meanings that all the students that I've worked with gain from those conversations. Role playing and having fun with the story. And one thing that I just remind students when I'm working with them, it's okay to have fun, but we want to remember that nations have shared these stories for the purpose of education. And so we want to go back, if we think about the meaning that we're making from stories, we want to make sure that we are treating these stories gently and respectfully. And one thing I often will say to students is we want to imagine that the person who's given us permission to use the story is in the classroom with us while we're engaging and making meaning from the story, and make sure that they feel comfortable with the way that we are treating this story. And so that helps students to kind of just think about what they're doing and maybe not get too silly. And again, this is making meaning from a story. It's not a reenactment of the story. So it may be kind of a reenactment, but it's for the purpose of making meaning, not for the purpose of sort of doing a show for people. It's a physical way to engage with the story. And stories need to be told and felt over and over again. And this is sort of the idea that we want to return to. So if we think about the First People's Principle, learning takes patience and time. If we think about returning to a story over several years, at the beginning of a year, at the end of the year, and looking at how our understanding of that story has shifted or changed. When we think about working with the stories or making meaning from the stories, Dr. Archibald talks about holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And those are the last 3 Indigenous story work principles that she talks about in her book. I wanted to kind of pause with holism because she talks about a spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual connection to the story. And she also talks about the importance of considering relationships, among oneself, family, community, nation, and wider society. And so we want to be thinking about those relationships when we're sharing the stories. And with her permission, I sort of developed this framework when I was working with teacher candidates. My apologies, there we go, sorry, dog drama was happening. The holistic engagement with stories, with her permission, I kind of came up with this framework based on her own work. And so she talks about this holistic engagement. And so the mental is the act of listening to the story. The physical is engaging in those activities that I mentioned briefly, again, to make meaning. And my experience has been, we can have a conversation and make meaning, but if we engage physically with a story, the meaning is that much deeper. Emotional is reflecting on the story. How do our experiences connect with those of the character in the story? How might the characters feel in the story? And spiritual, consider the teachings from the story. What is the story teaching us? And again, those answers will be different for each student. There might be some overlap. And I know with kind of English language arts background, sometimes we think about there is this singular meaning, and we want to move away from that, especially when we're working with Indigenous stories, traditional Indigenous stories. So, she also talks about the interrelatedness, so the cultural information and other important contextual information. Again, when we're sharing those stories, we want to provide that information. And when we're listening to those stories, having that information also helps us to make meaning from those stories. And I appreciate she really focuses in on synergy. And it's sort of that thing that we can't describe. And when she describes it in this article that I'm citing, she talks about sort of a translation from somebody who's in another nation, and it's sort of making it new. And this idea that when we're using a story to understand one thing and making meaning in another, it's sort of creating this new purpose, and that's when synergy happens. And so there is this experience of synergy that happens when we're working to make meaning from the stories. So I personally find that I find it difficult to explain, and yet when I'm in that moment, I really understand it. And an example I can give of synergy is when I was doing my doctoral research, I used one of our traditional stories as a metaphor for my methodology. And so the traditional story, we do a dance with it. And so I was working with the dance and the methodology and sort of thinking about how we do the dance, which is the dogfish atau, dogfish mother dance. And so I was imagining myself doing the dance and then also thinking about it as a metaphor. And I ended up coming to understand our traditional story more as a result of kind of comparing the two. And I also understood the methodology and the dance more as a result of that kind of sharing of knowledge across these two different spaces. And so that's kind of an example of synergy when we're thinking about that. And that happens when we're working with the stories, and we just kind of need to be aware and attuned to that possibility. So when we're working with stories, and I would say this is specifically for traditional Indigenous stories, but I would encourage you in especially English language arts, where we have these kind of set comprehension questions that, you know, they need to identify, or plot lines and things like that. I would encourage you to start thinking about other ways for students to make meaning from these stories that are based on their experiences and their identities. Making sure that you provide opportunities for students to share the meaning that they're making from those stories, because when we share the meaning with one another, that's when we start to have different understandings. It's also a really wonderful way to build relationships. I've seen with teacher candidates, Dr. Archibald often tells this story, Lady Louse, and I won't tell you what happens in Lady Louse, but often the different teacher candidates will talk about these experiences and feelings of being really overwhelmed. And as a result of the sharing that they do, they kind of build relationships with one another with those stories. And then we want to think about introducing questions that invite meaning making. So how does the story connect to your life? What are some experiences from your life that the story reminds you of? What can we learn from the characters or events of this story? And that's not to say that we limit it to these questions, but I find that lots of students like to have sort of a starting place before. I'm sorry, somebody just made the funniest little hand gesture. Anyways, so this is definitely a starting place. And I find that for students, if we start concretely and then kind of move to more abstract, that tends to support them a little bit. So we are going to go to a breakout group. I'm sorry, I'm just going to grab my pup because she is very loud. And so I'm interested I'm hoping that you'll share a little bit about how you currently bring Indigenous stories into your teaching practice. And what are some ideas that you have to expand on what you're already doing? And what are some of your favorite resources to support Indigenous stories? And these, as I say, these don't necessarily have to be traditional Indigenous stories. They could also be, just stories by Indigenous authors or oral stories by Indigenous storytellers.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to spend about 7 minutes in these groups, talk about what you're doing and how you're hoping to grow what you're doing in your context. See you in 7 minutes. Thanks, everyone.